Hello and welcome to AAC Access All Areas. My name is Ali Battye.
And I'm Ruth Jones. And today, episode 3, the question is, who decides which AAC to use? Which is a really interesting question, isn't it, Ali? I think
Mm.
particularly where we've talked about the challenges with access to services. So
Yes.
historically, big assessment, speech and language therapist, but we're in a bit of a murky water with it at the
We
minute, aren't we,
are,
I
yes,
think?
yes. And I would say, so there was a change in around, I want to say like 2015, maybe, when the funding slightly changed around AAC and we got a model which was referred to as hub and spoke, where the hub service was
Mhm.
like the regional AAC assessment service, and then the spoke bit of the wheel, if you think about it as being a wheel, was the local services, NHS services, because it was sort of like an NHS
Mhm.
model. And so the sort of ideal pathway through that would be a child would be referred into NHS speech and language therapy. The therapist would recognise that there was a need for AAC. They might start trialling things using paper-based AAC, see how that goes. And then perhaps if that child had really complex access needs, as in, they couldn't easily access regular computer equipment, including maybe a tablet in those days, so they're probably just coming in, then that speech and language therapist would be able to refer to the regional AAC assessment hub. And the child would go for a big assessment with usually a speech and language therapist, often an OT, maybe a technician there as well. In some services, they had a teacher there as well. And they would make a sort of joint decision with family input and school input, hopefully, and decide which high-tech device, if they were going down that high-tech route. So that was the model, and still is the model, to be fair, from 2015. Before that, there was like really unequal access to high-tech AAC, I
Mm.
would say. Um, but I guess paper-based AAC, would you say there was good access to paper-based AAC?
Yeah. Yeah, you know what? It goes back to that sort of, I think it's like who is actually designing paper-based AAC. And so I
Yeah.
think there's something about in lots of settings I work and have worked in, paper-based sort of AAC tools in the form of maybe like a core board have been really easy to
Mhm.
access. And so you see lots of those kinds of things. What I would say is there's things like robust AAC, paper-based tools like beefy communication books, thinking about like pod books, the pragmatic, organized, dynamic
Yeah.
display. That's always been held in a slightly different space because you've got to kind of have had the training, you've got to have
Mm.
particular software to be able to produce those, and also the resources. So when I worked in a school and we kind of prescribed a pod book as though it was going to be the best solution for that child at that point in time, I had like a couple of brilliant speech therapy assistants who worked through producing these pod books, would meet with the teams around that child and kind of pull together the right vocabulary. So for robust paper-based AAC,
Yeah.
while it's still, the access might be there, I actually think the resources needed to produce good vocabulary as well, because that's the thing, isn't it? Is that paper-based AAC can be really easy to make, but sometimes I think we miss the quality because perhaps that research evidence-based vocabulary package isn't there because people might be pulling together their own vocab that they're thinking about for a child. And
Yes.
that's really hard to navigate if you're a family that doesn't have a speech therapist support or the support of an
Absolutely. Yeah.
AAC specialist
Mm.
teacher, something like that, because
Yes.
you kind of just go down the route of nouns. I find you get so many people
Yeah.
who are like, oh, I'll put
Yeah.
all the things that they want to say, and then we have an I
Yes.
want or a I like and don't like, and that becomes
Yeah.
the AAC. So while access to paper can be easier, I think the quality of it sometimes can be a bit missing because you don't necessarily
Yes.
have that specialist support
Absolutely.
there.
It can end up being a good snapshot in time of what that child might want to communicate about, but it doesn't necessarily stand the test of time, does it? And that is the big frustration around paper-based AAC, that you need to constantly update AAC, and that's so easy on an iPad.
Mm,
Or using computer software, and it's so hard on paper based because you've got to, generally we would be laminating that communication book, and it's got tabs and everything, and it is
yeah.
good practice to leave a few spaces so that people can add new words to that,
Mm,
but that can quickly get sort of quite messy and disorganized. And I think
mm,
also people don't realise, but speech and language therapy has a huge scope of practice. So we work
mhm,
with so many different areas, from sort of adults who've had strokes or head injury, through to people who have eating and drinking difficulties, things like stammering, speech sounds, and then
mm,
through to language difficulties. And AAC, I would say, is quite a small specialism within speech and language
yeah.
therapy. And I would probably argue it's the area that speech and language therapists tend to be most scared of, because they might not have seen very much of it in their initial training. And
Mm.
honestly, I mean, the reason I went into AAC is it was my first placement. So I saw it in action and saw how amazing it was. But most of my peers didn't get that. So they never got that spark of interest to go and learn more about it.
Mm. And we didn't really cover it. Like, I was a bit like you. I had my second year placement was an adult community placement for people with neurological conditions, so post-stroke, motor neuron disease. And the first time I came across AAC was on that placement, and it was a light writer, which for anybody listening that hasn't come across one, they weighed a ton, and it was like a keyboard that was very old school blue and grey colour, and it had a little screen on the front so that the person typing could see what they were typing, and then a little screen on the back so that the communication partner could see the message that was being played. And it kind of a bit like a glorified calculator, really. But watching this lady who had lost her speech because of her, motor neurone disease, still have access to communication because she had the fine motor skills to be able to type at that point, was really powerful. And I don't think many of my peers on my course would have had the same, access to it. And then I also think, depending on what areas you work in, because for me, I went straight into autistic children residential special school. AAC, I had to live and breathe it because most of the children I was working with were non or minimally speaking. But I know for a lot of therapists, if you go into more like a generalized pediatric placement where, yes, you might be supporting non-speaking children, but you also are supporting the speech sounds and you're supporting language difficulties and delays and those sorts of generalized challenges that children, typically developing children might face. You kind of AAC is a small part of what you do, whereas
Yes,
it's always been so big in my
yes,
world.
yes. Yeah.
Um,
I used to work for Riverside, which is now Hammersmith. Well, it's probably changed name a few times. It then became Hammersmith and City PCT. But anyway, it was a really well-funded service. And so I remember we got Boardmaker straight away, like probably within months of
mm,
me starting as a speech and language therapist. And we were using that for everything. So Boardmaker is, a software for creating communication books and charts and things, but we were using that for everything, for like speech sound work and stuff.
mm,
So I guess I then built up a certain amount of confidence with using that software in its very early days of that
yeah.
simple software. So there was a series of happy accidents, I think, that led me into
Mm,
AAC. And for other speech and language therapists who haven't had those happy accidents, I do think that AAC can be a real area of fear, which, you and I would like to change, wouldn't we? Of just, spreading that message that
Yeah.
AAC is such a brilliant area. And arguably every speech and language therapist should know about AAC and be able to produce resources. There's no judgment there, by the way, if you're thinking, oh, I'm being told off
No.
now, because we completely understand why that is, and wish it was more part of the core training. I've probably gone off on a complete tangent there, Ruth. I'm so sorry. The question that we're supposed to be answering. Sorry.
Well, but I think it's just popped to my head as well when we're thinking about who decides and those
Mm.
challenges with it, is I have a few parents that have contacted me to say that they've spoken to other local speech therapists who have said they don't do AAC. And that's, again, it's like not a judgment, that's not loaded. It is just because they don't have the confidence. And so I think there is something about, I kind of feel like, oh, well, everyone's got some awareness and some knowledge, but I am so naive in my awareness and understanding of what people outside of my little bubble of autism and neurodiversity affirming practice, one, have access to in terms of training and support,
Yes.
but also, like you
Yes.
say, the tech resources and things. And so I think we have got to a place where who decides AAC maybe is actually not quite fitting, because the people that
Yes.
are kind of saying,
Yes.
oh no, maybe don't, maybe it's a confidence issue, or maybe it's that
Yes.
internalized historical pathways of, well, they've got to be able to have these prerequisites. So
Yes.
in my knowledge and experience, if I'm the deciding therapist, I would be like, come on, let's go, the earlier the better. But
Mhm.
other therapists, if their knowledge is different to mine and they're in
Yeah.
that deciding role, they might say, well, actually, we need to use paper-based first. We need to show them that they can put two symbols together, three symbols together. We need to
Mm.
prove all of these skills in
Mm.
order to get to AAC. And so I think there is this
Yes.
barrier around who decides. And I think parents and families are then feeling quite lost because therapists are saying, well, actually, they need to have these prerequisite skills. They need to be able to point and
Yes.
flip pages.
And it's useful to look at the origin of those prerequisites,
Mm,
because those prerequisites came from NHS England
yeah.
funding, which was designed for, I'm terrible with numbers, but if you had 10 children that need AAC, that NHS England funding was for the 10% of those children who had the most complex access
Mm-hmm.
needs. So it was the children who couldn't access an iPad or a sort of standard keyboard on a computer. So there was always that sort of understanding that for 90% of AAC users, they wouldn't reach that criteria. So services for the regional hubs did have to be
Mm,
rationed. And then that's where your criteria of they must have paper-based in place, they must have cause and effect
mm,
understanding, they must have good receptive language compared to their
yeah.
expressive language, etc. Those requisites that people often quote, that was only ever designed for that
Mm,
10% of AAC users that had complex access needs. So it all gets a little bit jumbled, and we're probably going to stress over and over and over again on this podcast, there are no prerequisites. And since I sort of put that into practice, there isn't, well, is there a lower age limit? Yes, I suppose there is a lower age limit in terms of what a child can physically access. So they have to have some sort of fine motor control. But I would put that at around 18 months, maybe sort of 20,
yeah.
22 months for some children. So, if we're working with a child where we know there's going to be long-term difficulties around access to speech, I can't really think of any harms that we could do by introducing another mode of language,
No.
another communication mode. Because, so yes, speech might develop and they might not need it for very long, but that's not going to have harmed them in any way.
No.
And, we also always quote this research around, does AAC restrict a child's speech development or affect a child's speech development? Does it stop them developing speech? No. The research is very, very clear. So there's a review by Miller, Light and Schlosser, and that concluded that for 10% of children who had AAC introduced, there was no change to their speech output, so it didn't increase it or decrease it. But for 90% of children, it actually increased their speech output, as well as opening up another communication mode. So the evidence is quite the opposite, that it supports speech, and that certainly plays out in my practice. Ruth, does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that thing, isn't it? When we think about deciding on an AAC tool and who's kind of feeding into those conversations, that I speak to a lot of parents where they'll say, oh, I think that might be a bit too much for them, or I think that might be a bit too overwhelming. And I think it's that sort of notion, isn't it, that there might be there's myths around AAC, and I think that's really is one of those myths, is that it will impact speech. It doesn't. If anything, it has no impact. But on the great side, for most children, it has a really positive impact for them. And I think there's that other myth when we think about AAC, is that people feel like actually you've got to start small, or not start small, one giant symbol that's A4 sized, or, like two big symbols. And I think maybe if there's some access issues or some visual impairment, that means you need things slightly bigger. But I think the other thing that we kind of see is that depending on who is deciding and who is kind of having the say in what AAC tools, you can find that people want to start small and grow. And there are all sorts of challenges with that around, motor planning and changing pictures, because you're moving things like you talked about with paper-based systems, how you edit those and shift and grow vocabulary in paper-based systems, and who's in charge of that. And I think there is that piece that for a lot of parents at the minute, they're the ones pushing and deciding that their child is ready for AAC. And I think my message is that seek out support if you can, if you have access to that privileged financial support or access to that postcode privilege. So you've got an NHS therapist who's got some knowledge and can support you, then do, because there are things to consider. But also, you don't need permission from a speech and language therapist to introduce AAC to your child. And there is that shift in power and the balance there, isn't there? Because I think some parents feel like they need permission, and you don't. Like, it will probably be more effective.
And I would say that is the brilliant thing about social communication, specifically I would say Instagram, because I've had so many parents say to me that they've learned so much from Instagram, around topics like sensory integration, Gestalt language processing, and also AAC. So if you do not have access to speech and language therapy services, you can actually find a lot out there on Instagram or Facebook, or blog posts written by parents or by AAC users themselves. Like there's so much that I have learnt written by AAC users themselves that has really changed my practice. It's been really impactful. So, if you don't have access to a speech and language therapist, all is not lost. You can still go on that journey in sort of by yourself. But I would say have a community around you, because it can be quite tough. I would imagine it's very, very tough for a parent going on that journey by themselves. So having a community of other people doing the same thing. And being able to ask questions. A bit of a plug for a Facebook group that's really good. Ask Me, I'm an AAC user. I would say that would be my number one recommendation if you are a parent going it alone. And even if you're not on Facebook, it's worth joining Facebook just for that group. Because if you have any question, AAC users will reply, and they get priority of replying. So I think any question that goes on there, nobody else is allowed to answer it for a certain length of time. It might be 24 hours or it might be 3 days or something, so that the AAC users themselves get to weigh in and give their expert opinion.
think when we think about who's deciding, that actually we can offer a range of different tools and different, as a therapist, I might be thinking about some paper-based, some tech-based. I might be thinking about different apps, different symbols, different sizes of symbols on, on the iPad or on paper-based. But who decides ultimately is the individual, because it's whatever they seem to relate to, whatever they seem to gravitate to. And you then can kind of grow from there, can't you? You've got some children and individuals who would really go techie, some prefer paper, some like really bright color symbols,
Yes.
some like kind of grey background, keeping it simple, not too busy on a screen. And so I think there's
Yes.
ultimately
Yes.
that you consider the therapy perspective and the kind of specialist perspective. You consider parents, families, teachers and educators, that whole team, but at the heart of it is about that individual and what do they decide.
Yes, it's got to be appealing to
Hmm.
them, hasn't it? Because they're not going to use something that looks, it might be as simple as like the wrong
Yeah,
colours sometimes. I mean, I do find it funny that sometimes with these really complex AAC assessments, you might have multiple professionals in the room, but ultimately, it's just whether that appeals to the child or not, and sometimes an assessment can be within a minute because that child just dives for that thing and starts using it straight away, which is a very efficient use of
yeah,
resources to carry out an assessment. Put it in front of a child and see if they go with
yeah,
it. And I would say if you're a parent going this alone, you can simplify this process. We're potentially making it sound very, very complicated, but it can be very simple in terms of choose a robust AAC
yeah.
app. And there are a handful that I always recommend. So Grid for iPad, TD Snap, Proloquo to Go, and Proloquo. They're two separate apps. Those are all brilliant, robust AAC apps. And as long as you don't mess with
Mm.
those, so don't change the basic layout, don't change the home screen, because they're all designed with an extensive vocabulary and logical organisation of that language into categories or situation-based vocabulary. So don't mess with that. But if you choose one of those and do a bit of research, go online and look at the guidance that goes with that app. So like Proloquo to Go have absolutely loads
Yeah.
of information, as do the others that I've said. Just do a bit of basic background research around it, and you can't go very far wrong if you choose one of those robust
Mm.
apps.
Hard work's been done for you there, hasn't
And then
it?
yes, yeah. I think with all of those you can get a free trial as well. So you could potentially try a couple of different ones out with your child and see which one your
Mm.
child sort of takes to. Um, yeah, you can see examples of that on our Instagram.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think,
Sorry,
no,
Ruth.
no, I was just gonna say the other thing I sometimes recommend is if your child is in a setting, is just checking in with the team as well. Because while we always say that the individual should choose, I do think particularly if you're starting out with AAC and you've maybe got a child where you're going to be really heavily teaching because they're not just picking it up and using it, finding something, if for example they're going to a school and the school already have AAC users and the team at that school are used to, Proloquo to Go, for example, actually that might feed into making your choice as a parent, because if you're deciding, that when your child goes to school and they take their AAC to school, the team at school are already familiar with Proloquo to Go, they're already familiar with how to edit it and familiar with how to teach it. And so it's kind of one of those controversial opinions, I think, sometimes. But I do think when we think about communication, we have to think about communication partners and we have to think about the environment that that child is going to be communicating in. And if at home there's no AAC users and you're going to be learning whether you're choosing Grid or Prolo or TD Snap, but if at school there is already some experience and some skill set, sometimes that can be part of the decision as well. Because I often say to TAs and teachers in schools, it's a bit like they get used to speaking, I don't know, like I've got quite a lot of children who use Grid Supercore. And so the adults around them get used to speaking Grid Supercore as though we'd start speaking French. And then you get a child come in
Yeah.
and they've maybe got voco
Yeah.
chat, which is still part of the grid for
Yes.
iPads, but the vocabulary set's
Mm.
different. And it really throws communication partners. And it's like almost switching from
Mm.
French to German when you're supporting two different. So I think that is part of who decides is actually if you are a parent and you have a child in the
Yeah.
setting,
Yeah.
it's worth considering that as well.
Yes, and I would say if there was a hierarchy of sort of decision making, I would put the individual at the top of
Yeah.
that hierarchy, and probably their family, the people that they live with next, because they are going to have most long term,
Yeah.
lifelong sort of influence and be the support throughout that child and into adulthood. Um, and then probably it would be schools. I have had like multiple occasions where I've had that scenario that you describe, Ruth. So a child has come into that school with a particular AAC app, and maybe a member of staff has said to me, can we change it to Pro
Yes.
Loquo because we're a Pro Loquo school? And under those circumstances, I
No.
wouldn't say that that justifies a change.
No.
If that is that child's established AAC system, they've spent a long time getting to know that, getting to know where the words are, how it's all organised, and getting those motor
Yeah.
plans for. So, but what I mean by motor plan is that your finger just goes there automatically. So a bit like when we drive or we ride a bike, we don't have to think what our legs are doing, what our hand and arm is doing. It's just all automatic because we've done it lots and lots. And the same happens with AAC, that there are certain things that when we do it over and over again, our finger will just go there. We don't have to think about it. So that frees up our thinking space for what we want to communicate about and gives us more sort of capacity for communication. So if it is purely for sort of like the benefit of teaching staff that you would change a package, I don't feel as though
No.
that is a strong enough justification for that. But if you're starting this from
Yeah.
scratch, and we were really talking about that scenario, then there is that
Yeah, definitely. I'm having lots
consideration
of
as well.
conversations at the minute about that sort of thing, going, right, guys, I know that you find this hard because it is different, but actually this child is used to using this system. So while it looks different, it's still the same skills. It just takes a little bit of time, and kind of then for the team, go with grace and go gently on yourselves. You're not going to be able to model and find vocabulary as quickly as other packages you're more familiar with, but you cannot be in control of that child's access to words that they have been learning. And, so I think that is really
Yeah,
important.
and it can be a really useful learning curve for the
Mm.
people supporting that child, because they get to experience what that child is experiencing when they're learning to use AAC, like that they don't know where things are. And I always say that to people who are supporting a child, like, don't worry if you forget where something is or you get lost within a package. Sort of make that explicit to the child, like, whoops, I've gone into the wrong page. I
Mm.
thought it was in transport, but maybe it's in places or something like that. Just so that that child knows it's a perfectly normal part of AAC communication to make mistakes and forget where things are. Just as with spoken communication, sometimes we forget the right word for something, or we go down a rabbit hole with something. And that's all part of normal communication. I think we tend to think of communication as being like really seamless, like one
Yeah.
person takes a turn and then the other person takes a turn. It's not actually very much like a game of tennis. It's a bit more like a sort of like we all bundle into the middle and something crazy comes out, that we contribute to one another's messages, we interrupt each other, we change what we're saying halfway through. That is just as true with AAC communication as it is with spoken
Yeah.
communication.
I think, as we quite nicely evidence in our conversations on this podcast. So
Yes, And I want to just say, I'm so sorry where I interrupt Ruth. I think we have a slight time lag when we record, and also we're both very enthusiastic about this topic, and I am definitely an interrupter, which I'm constantly trying to work on. So I do apologise to all the listeners when I'm talking over Ruth. I know that's really annoying, and I'm trying to not to do it.
Oh, we both do. And I think it's, part of honouring our communication style, isn't it? That actually it's just raw, purposeful, passionate talking about things. So I hope that
unedited, access all areas.
Yeah, that's it, including our minds, which will be wonderful for all the listeners, I'm sure. So I think we've talked quite a lot there, haven't we, about who decides kind of what AAC, and
I just wanted to say,
yeah.
Ruth, now, having said I won't interrupt you, I'm just going to instantly interrupt you, because I realise that we haven't talked about occupational therapists, and they can have a very, very important part to play where there are complex access needs. So, if we're supporting a child who can't access an iPad accurately, they would be the kind of child that you would want to be referring into those AAC regional assessment centres, and an OT would be involved in that assessment process, to have a look at access methods, which could be things like using switches, which are sort of buttons, which could be placed in various different locations. You can get head switches or buttons on a wheelchair tray, or like really ingenious options like a chin switch or a toe switch. I've used a child using a toe switch in the past, or options like eye gaze to access a screen. So that's where an OT would play a really important part in that assessment process, because the speech and language therapist gets to sort of weigh in about the vocabulary and the language organisation, but the OT would be making decisions or contributing to decisions around the visual display, and things like if a child is using switches, that dwell time, so the delay between pressing and activating on the screen. So yeah, it's not all that the speech and language therapist gets to make all the decisions. If you are going for a formal assessment, an OT has a big part to play as well.
Yeah, definitely. And in fact, that will lead us quite nicely onto the question for episode 4. So we will round this one off here. Thank you, everyone. And watch out for the next episode when we're going to delve a bit more into what factors do we think about when we're considering AAC. So thanks for listening.